Hi guys, it's Adam at the Astro Imaging channel, and tonight's presentation is by Josh Smith, and it's on astrophotography setups from the ground up. So he's going to help you understand a little bit more about getting started in astrophotography. And as for right now, I'm going to hand it right over to Josh. Josh, here you go.
Thanks, Adam. Okay, so tonight we are going to go through everything you need to get started in astrophotography, and I'm just going to check with Adam and make sure you can see the PowerPoint.
Actually, no, right now I see your Google Hangout screen.
Oh, let me change then. Okay, how about now?
Now I see it, yes.
Okay. All right, so I'm going to go through setups and pretty generically go through the setups to start with. The hope is we'll start some discussions about different types of gear you need, but a lot of times when people get into astrophotography, I don't think that they're very aware of how much gear you actually need, and that there's actually a lot of times a good bit of experimentation to get stuff like spacing correct, to get your cameras working with your computers, to get your mounts working with your telescope, to get your software all working, make sure you have the right kind of cables, the right kind of power. All that stuff just kind of adds up and it becomes overwhelming. So what we're going to do tonight is just try to briefly touch on almost everything you need, and as much as possible we'll give some examples of each type of gear or equipment or software that you might need. And then hopefully we'll have enough questions that we can sort of pause after we go over each type of gear. So I'll get started here, and just kind of, you can break it down to as fine a resolution as you want with every kind of gear and software that you need, but I tried to make it into some categories that at least made some sense, and I thought about the setup as required types of gear from the ground up. So that's kind of how we're going to go through this PowerPoint here, and basically to think of everything you need to get started for pretty much a regular deep sky object imaging setup. You need something to power all of that. You need a mount or platform or something that will track the sky for you, assuming that you're not taking star trails. You need obviously something to actually image through, like a telescope or lens of some sort. You need something to actually capture the images, some sort of camera, and oftentimes you might need 2 cameras or 3 cameras depending on how in depth you go with your cameras. But you need your regular imaging camera, and then you might need a guide camera. Sometimes you use them for other things as well. You also need a computer at some point if you're going to be doing astrophotography. Not everyone always uses a computer when they are out in the field, although I'd say most people do, or most people do in their observatory, and that's to run your mount and to run your cameras and whatever else you might want to be running. And then you need to think about what kind of software you're going to be using. I think a lot of people underplay the importance of software in astrophotography. A lot of times maybe they'll try and skimp on it and not spend as much as they do on their hardware, and a lot of people who have $4, $5, $10,000 sunk into the hardware of their setup, have a $4,000 telescope, and then they're afraid to spend $200 on software. There's ways to get through without spending a lot on software, but the software today is amazing, and it's really sort of a lot of what's made astrophotography so accessible to so many people, because stuff like acquisition software can run your mount, focus your telescope, control the heat of your camera, it can guide for you, it'll run every part of your camera, including choosing where your filter wheel is, and even some software actually focuses your camera as you're taking pictures. So there's a lot really to take advantage of in the acquisition software, and we'll talk for a while about that. And then you get into processing software, and again, there's quite a few choices to do your processing, and it can be anything from free to $300, $400, $500, and a lot of us actually will combine a handful of different processing softwares because several of them do several things really well, and some of them do one thing really well, and some of them do a lot of things and none of them great. So, I think the people who really get it figured out have a combination of softwares. But you might want to start off with one and figure out how to use one pretty well. And then after you get one down, you might want to move on to another. So it's a lot to go over with that as well. Adapters. Adapters is a big deal. As anybody knows who gets into actually trying to create their setups, uh, there's spacing issues, there's changing size of your tube issues, there's ways to mount your telescope, there's just tons of stuff to go over with adapters, and it's something that you also need to think about. And then finally, there's an endless list of peripherals, and I won't even go into what all I'm talking about there, but the main telescope and main camera and mount cost a lot to get you going, but you can't forget about the rest of the stuff to actually make it all work together. And that stuff actually adds up to a decent bit of money as well. So you need to think about that when you're thinking about how to actually put your whole package together. So before I actually start getting into any of these, for people who haven't joined us before in the Astroimaging channel, both in YouTube and here in the Google Hangout, you can ask questions. There's a group chat on the side of the Google Hangout where you can ask questions, and it's definitely encouraged, especially tonight. We're hoping to develop some nice conversations about different kinds of gear. And if you're in YouTube watching it, submit your questions to the Q&A, and somebody will be monitoring that, probably Adam tonight, and he'll get the questions over right away. So, as I said, I'm going to get started here, but I want to just sort of, kind of touch on the basics of what each of these are, and then we'll stop after each one of these sections and see if there's any questions, suggestions. If you have a better solution than what I'm presenting, please speak up and let everybody else know so we can share as much as possible. Throughout this setup, I kind of been basing a lot of the equipment on what I've used, and so there's a lot of other stuff, and what I've used isn't necessarily the best, so there's a lot of better options out there too. So I will get started, and I'll start by talking about how you're going to supply power. And that's sort of a big deal right off the bat, because without power, whether you're at home or you're in the field or wherever you are, then you're not going to be able to run everything. And unfortunately, there's no universal power requirement or power connection supply for all of your gear. A lot of times you'll get a mount that has an AC requirement, or it just comes with an AC plug, and then your camera might come only with a DC plug, and one of your cameras might run off 12 volts, one might run off of 7 volts, one might run off 5 volts. You'll have dew heaters, you'll have your filter wheel, coolers. There's just your computer as well. There's a lot of things that need power out in the field, and there's a lot of different requirements for them. So there's really two ways to attack it, and it depends on if you're at home or you're in the field of how you'll attack it, and it's with AC or DC power. If you're at home or you're in an observatory, I think personally the best way to deal with it is by using AC power. You don't have to worry about your batteries running out or changing batteries in the middle of the night, and you're not constantly cycling your batteries. Even deep cycle batteries eventually wear out if you do that, especially the ones that you get like at Walmart or something like that. So, you can power stuff if you're in your driveway with an extension cord. You can use AC power to actually hook up to a DC power supply, which is what I really like to do. You can also, create outlets in your observatory right by your gear, which a lot of people do have observatories, and then you can plug everything directly in right next to your mount. You don't have to worry about running cables or cords along the ground. So, you can do any of those for AC power. If you're out in the field, you don't really have a choice, except for maybe sometimes at star parties or places that are devoted to astrophotographers. And not even all star parties will provide AC power. I've been to some, but like almost Heaven's Star Party does not. However, they'll give you charging stations for your batteries. I've been to Okie Star Party and the Winter Star Party, which do give you power supplies. So, and at some point, if you're a remote imager or you live in light pollution, you want to go to a dark site, you're going to need to power your gear somehow. And the best choices are deep cycle marine batteries. The reason I think that's the best choice is because you get the most capacity, and you'll be able to run your gear all night long. You may need one, you may need two, or you may only need part of one battery. I personally use two batteries if I go out in the field, and I'll get into why in just a minute here before I move on from this page. But some people, instead of carrying around those big heavy batteries, will use small battery packs for everything. You can power your mount on a pretty small battery for the night. You can load your DSLR up with a couple of charged batteries, and you can charge the battery on your laptop. And so, technically you could get through a night without any kind of large battery to bring with you. However, it's kind of playing with fire there. In case one of your items runs down quick, then you'll be out maybe far away from home and take a nice trip to a dark site, and all of a sudden you can't do anything because you don't have a backup power supply. So in fact, I actually usually bring two batteries plus a third for a backup in case for some reason I forgot to charge one, or one drains really quickly that night. So the other thing that people do is bring a bunch of small battery packs, something in between full-size batteries and batteries for each of your components. And it's one way to do things. I think it's sort of inefficient. But so before I move on from power, I want to get into connectors and why I use two batteries at the same time. A lot of Astro gear or other kind of remote power supplies use cigarette lighter plugs or adapters, whatever you want to call them. And they're fine and they're common, and a lot of times they won't kill you. But I've had probably a half dozen or a dozen of those die on me in the year and a half or 2 years that I've been using them. So, well, really, I've gone away from using them for pretty much everything that I can, because they don't have consistent connections all the time. They're apt to corrode. Oftentimes, they're rated for a higher amperage than they can actually supply. They don't actually usually last very long, and I'm not sure if it's because there's a lot of exposed metal in the elements, but they also can just jiggle out of their connection pretty easily. One thing that a lot of gear uses also is stereo plugs, and sometimes there's no getting away from using stuff like that. Like on your dew heaters, oftentimes there will be stereo plugs. So if you have a dew heater controller, unless you make it yourself, then from the dew heater controller to your dew heater strip, you might not be able to go away from that stereo plug. But I wouldn't usually recommend using that as the main hookup for your power supply over to your other gear. Moving on from there, sometimes there's auxiliary connectors, and those are usually a little more secure. However, they're a little bit more of a pain to actually wire. Frequently, those will be used for some sort of heating or cooling, and I don't think usually for a lot else, but I could be wrong. I just haven't run into them very often. So then getting into the world of kind of auto parts and RC hobbies and stuff like that, where people are always running DC power supplies, the best two that I usually use are Dean's connectors and power poles. And so the reason that I use those, I'll go into Dean's connectors first. Dean's connectors have really secure connections, and they're usually able to run at very high currents, higher than we would normally need, but you can run 12 volts at 40 or 50 amps with them, which is more than you'll ever need. But sometimes you might want to use 12 volts at 20 amps or something like that. and you also can't plug them in incorrectly because of the way that they're designed. So, they're good, but they're also a little bit fiddly to actually get connected to each other. So I use those on a couple things maybe that I had left over from my RC hobbies. But the thing that I usually like to use the most are power poles. And so power poles are sexless connectors. They're impossible to plug in backwards. They're very easy to plug in, but they also have a very firm connection. You can get them rated anywhere from 10 amps to 15 amps to 40 amps. And really, I think it's best if you get to the point where almost all of your power supplies and power connections, or at least as many as possible, are using one kind of connector. The reason I say this is that if you're out in the field, it's a lot easier to repair something that you have on hand, and if you only have one kind of connector you need to replace, then it's a lot less to carry around. So in my toolbox now, instead of having a soldering iron and heat shrink and solder and all that stuff, now I just carry around the Dean's Connect, or the Power Poles tools. And the nice thing about them is you don't have to solder them either. They're just crimp connections that go into those plastic housings, and so that's what I like to use out in the field. They also have things called rig runners, and I don't have that pictured here. All I have is I think it's a 5-way splitter where I have a battery coming into it and then power going out 5 ways. The rig runners are great, and if you look up power poles rig runners, they have individual fuses for each one of your plugs, and then an overall fuse for the entire strip. And it's nice because it can protect you from reverse polarity, for any kind of power spike. It really protects your equipment. Makes it easier to know what you want to plug everything into. And you can get them for quite a few things at once, or quite a few connections at once. So this is an old picture, but now sometimes I have 2 telescopes going at the same time. I have, I think, 9 things plugged in at one time, and it's just nice to know that I'm not going to worry about any kind of thing spiking and damaging any of my other gear. So before I move on from power, I told you that I use 2 separate batteries, and the reason why, and I haven't ran into this being an issue yet, but I've definitely heard of it from people, is that a lot of your gear needs some sort of pulse width modulation control. And pulse width modulation control usually is used on things like heating and cooling stuff. It can be used on actually controlling your mount itself. It can be used for quite a few different things. So your dew heater strip might have it, your camera cooler might have it, your mount might be running off of that. So the reason that I like to separate that stuff is it can cause noise in your cables, and sometimes if you're routing cables together, which is another point that I'll make, you might want to route them separately, and you might want to run a separate power supply for anything that's running off of PWM. It's a shame to work really hard on your mount to get really great and accurate tracking, and then have your signal kind of muffed up a little bit by some sort of PWM signal. So again, I haven't run into it, at least in astrophotography. I have run into kind of interference or signal issues in other hobbies and other work I do. So it's just good practice. I mean, and the other thing that's nice too is spend a little bit more to get that second battery and run those connections separately, and then I know I'm not going to run out of power for the night. So I use 2 12-volt, roughly 100 amp hour batteries, and that'll get me through the night fine. When I was only using one at first, it might get me through 5, 6, 7 hours, depending on how cold it is out. If it's colder, your battery's going to run out a little bit faster, but if it's hotter, then you might be running your cooling at quite a bit higher power for your camera. So usually, like I said, 100, 120 amp hours, maybe even a little bit bigger, could definitely get you through the night for any gear. But just to play it safe, it's easier for me to split them up into two separate setups. So I see Eric, before I move on, actually hold up a picture of a rig runner setup. And I am going to share that real quick before moving on so that everyone can see what I'm talking about. Eric, is that okay with you if I share that?
I'm sure it is because he shared it on Astrovan, and I'm
Okay.
I'm looking at it myself. Oh no, it's on a different screen.
Okay, so kind of talking through some of what I was talking about here. Eric's got the rig runner set up, and I can see, if you see where my mouse is pointing, here's the power pole connectors, and here's where the separate fuse is for each of those connections. So again, I think that you can get them with 5, 6, 7, 9, 10, or 11 ports, whatever you might need. Sometimes you might run two separate ports, sometimes you might just run one port. So I'm going to scroll down on the picture here. Eric told me to come down. So again, for power supplies, I mentioned that I like to use a DC power supply, and I see that Eric is actually using a power supply as well. And same company that I use, Pyramid, and mine is a 12 volt 30 amp. It looks like Eric's might be a 12 volt 10 or 15 amp, I'm not sure. But anyways, so what I have done with my setup is kind of put it in a way where I am able to bring it to a dark site or just run it from my driveway without having to really replace anything, except for I replace the power supply end from a DC power supply to my two batteries. So I'll either plug my DC power supply straight into a cord in my driveway, or if I'm out at a dark site, then I take the two sets of connections and run them into two batteries. So these DC power supplies are great because they're regulated power supplies, so you know that you're going to be getting 12 volts, or you can actually adjust them. You might be getting 12.7 volts. But it's nice. The cleaner you get your power supply set up, and the more repeatable you get it, the better shape you're going to be in. The less time it'll take to set up every night, the quicker you'll be imaging, the less chance you'll have for errors. Anybody who's been a remote imager for very long has taken a trip out to a dark site and got 98% of the way set up, and then found out that they were missing one tiny USB cable, or one T adapter was missing, or one plug from your power supply was missing, and well, your hour and a half drive is dead, and then you have to turn all the way, turn around and come all the way back home. So this kind of stuff is really good to sort out at home before you go out to the dark site. And when you're first starting, and maybe even when you get going, it's good to make a list. Just make a checklist so that before you go out every night, you know that you have everything that you need. And you can see how Eric's set up on his telescope and on his mount is very clean, and he's got everything he needs right there. If you look down on the bottom right, you can see it looks like he's got just a couple of AC plugs coming in. But that's the way, if it's not by nature for you to be very organized, and it's not for me necessarily, it's really good to take your time and get this stuff all clean and organized and set up. I see that Frank is asking how you charge your batteries at a week-long star parties. Every star party that I've been to, at least, offers, if not power in the field, they offer power at some kind of central meeting location. Almost Heaven Star Party was pretty good. There's kind of a little bit of a mad rush to make sure that we got to get everything charged up. And it's a little bit tougher there too, because you're trying to charge two DC batteries and you want to be polite and not take all the outlets, and there's very minimal outlets there. If you go to somewhere like Okie Tech's Star Party, like I said, there's plugs out in the field, but then there's also quite a few power supplies up at the building. I think that there might be one or two star parties I've heard of where they actually don't provide any kind of power. And then if you're at that point, there's a another thing that some people do, and they actually use solar panels to charge their batteries during the day. Some people actually will use solar panels and supplement their AC power supplies so that they can charge other things up. They're getting much, much cheaper. I don't remember exactly what the cost was, but some people that I met at the most recent Star Party had 2 solar panels. I think that cost $300 each. And well, as long as it's sunny where you're at the Star Party, then that was enough to give them full charges during the daylight hours. You know, within 5 or 6 hours, they are able to charge their deep cycle batteries. So I won't do too much longer on power so that we can kind of hit some of the other things, but I want to make sure, is there any questions from the Q&A yet, Adam? Are we good?
I haven't seen any from the Q&A, but I actually had one question. Do you have a rig runner?
Mm-hmm.
Do you have yours mounted on the tube, on top of the tube like Eric does?
I actually have 2 rig runners, and I've been experimenting where I mount them, but yes, now I have it on top of the tube. I used to have it mounted on this box here, and I ran everything from the box over to my mount, but it got to the point where I think I had 14 cables running to my mount and telescope, and I was starting to be afraid of snagging and stuff. So now I have it up on top of my tube, and I'm in the process of replacing all of my cables with as short as possible cables. I think I had the 6-meter ones for my USBs and all my power stuff, and now I'm trying to get down to like 2 feet ones for everything.
Yeah, because I have a rig runner, and I've yet to install it, because every time I like pick it up and look at it, I can't figure out where the most effective place to put it is. Because I have to put my dew heater or my dew controller up on top. It kind of like it's a commitment. You have to get down below.
So one thing I've gotten to, because it's kind of a pain to put all of that off, is I got 2 of, and I wish I had a picture of this, I have 2 of those little ADM Vixen dovetail adapters, and for those of you who don't know what that is, just search ADM Mini Vixen saddles. And what I did is I mounted a dovetail on top of those Mini Vixen saddles, and then I have a Vixen dovetail on top of my scope. So I have like a 2-story Vixen setup on top of my scope, and it has everything I run off of there now. It has my dew heater, my the controller for my focuser, has my rig runner, has my USB power supply, and I think it has one other thing, but I can't remember what it is. And then I mount a couple things on the side of my mount too. I've kind of gone back and forth on things like my dew heater going from the side of my mount to the top of my mount. So I'm going to say, read what Eric said. He said there's a single wrapped cable coming down from the rig runner to the power sources carrying power and the USB connection. The cable is tied to the mount with loops that never tangle. And so that's another good point, is that the reason that we're talking about mounting all of this stuff on our telescope is to actually keep you from having things like cable snag or tangling or even cable drag, just because once you have 14 cables, they start actually getting pretty heavy, and the wind can actually blow them and pull on your scope. So you know, there's even a solution that I've looked at getting, where they have saddles now that have USB connectors and power supplies built into the saddles themselves. They're actually machined out of the aluminum. I can't remember the name of it offhand.
Mount Hub Ultimate?
Mount Hub Ultimate, yes, that's it. So
and it's a focus controller, a dew heater controller, all Wi-Fi capable, I believe.
I did not know it was Wi-Fi capable. That's awesome. So just to kind of wrap up on that, so that to me is sort of the ultimate solution if it works. And I don't know if I haven't heard from people whether or not the saddle is actually strong enough or all the connections are good, but all of this mangled mess here on my table that you see, as well as a focuser controller, is all actually built into the saddle, and I think they go for around $500 if I remember correctly. And so it's one of those trade-offs that you just kind of have to think about if it's worth it for you. All this stuff separately probably costs almost $500 too, but really you want to make sure that you're just being as organized as possible. And I think the ultimate desire for everybody would be just to have one small cable running from their mount, maybe one small cable running from their mount to their power supply. And even in a perfect world, you wouldn't even have to run anything to your computer, but maybe at most one thing to your computer and one thing to your power supply. I'm working towards trying to get that. And several mounts actually do a lot to help you route your cables and route your power as well. So hopefully, we spent more time on this than I wanted to, but hopefully everyone sees that it's actually a really important thing to think about, and it can have a large impact on your astrophotography session. And all the appliances aren't aboard attachment.
And I want to correct myself. Not Wi-Fi capable. It's USB, but it's one USB going to your computer. And the new version is 700 pounds.
700 pounds. Okay.
So $2,000.
So that's a lot.
Yeah.
Yeah, and so it sounds like Eric is saying he does something very similar to what I do. He's got all of this stuff set up on one plate, it sounds like, that he can take on and off, or one board that he can take on and off of his scope as well with Vixen connectors. So it sounds like he does something pretty similar. So we can come back to this at the end of the session and talk about it more. But as I said, I just wanted to make sure everyone sees that it's kind of a big thing to think about in the beginning. So I'm going to kind of go through mounts a little bit more quickly. But so working from the ground up, the next thing would be your mount. And getting started, if you don't know anything about them, there's even more than this, but there's German equatorial mounts, Altaz mounts, barn door trackers, equatorial platforms, and cannon tracking mounts. And for, because this is about astrophotography, I'll just say that if your plan long-term is to do deep sky objects, the best option is a German equatorial mount. Not saying that it can't be done with an Altaz mounts. It can, and there's people who do it, but you'll be limited on your exposure time due to rotation in your field, and some people even talk about getting derotators. But if you're committed to doing astrophotography, the best solution is a German equatorial mount. If you want to get into it and just play around and experiment before you spend much money, you can make yourself a barn door tracker. If you just Google barn door tracker, you can spend maybe $100 or a couple $100, especially if you're handy or know anything about electronics. Then they're fun little things to make, and I've played around with making one before, and they work reasonably well, especially at very short focal lengths. If you're shooting somewhere between maybe 50 and 200 millimeters, then you could get a decent sky exposure. Equatorial platforms, especially dual axes equatorial platforms, are typically made for Dobsonians. The dual axes ones allow you to image for longer on the Dobsonians. It's maybe, again, not something I would recommend for a long-term solution for deep sky object imaging. However, they are terrific if you're doing planetary or lunar imaging. I'm not sure how many people use Dobs for imaging the sun, but they work really well. They're pretty easy to build. They're not very expensive. You can see at the bottom of this Dob here, I actually made an equatorial platform using 3D printed pieces and cut aluminum stock and a motor I bought online, and I actually found a hand controller that I bought and rigged up to it. I also made a controller. You can use either a DC motor or a stepper motor. Typically stepper motor is better, but a lot of times that's how people get their start in astrophotography, is with a Dob and a cell phone or a little webcam and some sort of equatorial platform. And it's fun to build, and it'll get you going, and it'll definitely give you the AP bug, and that'll be your first step into the obsession. One thing that could be a little bit more of a permanent solution is a camera tracking mount, especially if you're shooting at very short focal lengths. I'm not real familiar with a lot of them, but they're a much cheaper way to get into astrophotography if you're only going to use like a DSLR and a lens. You can use, I think there's an Iopton Sky Tracker and a couple other choices. Again, I'm not, I think AstroTrack is one of them. And people will use these, and then you can get really good images. A lot of times they're a lot more portable and smaller. You might have to buy a handful of accessories to get them up and running, but if you're just looking for really wide field shots and want to get into it cheap and be ultra portable or bring something in your backpack, that's really the way to go. And it might be something I'd look into someday too, just for, you know, if you're going on vacation and want to carry something on the plane, that's something that you could think about doing. It's definitely a cost-effective way to get into it, and maybe one of the good ways that you can do it without actually using a computer. So just quickly to kind of talk about some of the mount options for people who don't know much about them, just called out a handful of particular ones. There's, you know, kind of at the German equatorial mounts, they're, you know, by class, sort of the Celestron AVX is probably one of the cheapest ones to get into, and it's fine for starting, especially at short focal lengths. Maybe doesn't latch up quite as well with the Schmidt Cassegrain that it's sold with. That is due to not having a bearing on the deck axis. It just has a bushing, and so sometimes you get stiction in there, and it's a little bit harder to track. So the next step up might be something like a Orion Sirius or Atlas mount, and I misspelled Sirius there, sorry. So, and those run anywhere from about $1,200 to $1,500, and they actually have an Atlas Pro now that can be run as an alt or as mount, and or an equatorial mount, and that one will run, I think, around $1,800 to $2,000, and some stepping up a little bit more expensive and more robust, a little bit more capacity, or like the Losmandy G11, then the Astrophysics Mach 1, which has the same kind of listed capacity, but it's actually a full capacity for imaging. And so that's one thing when you're looking at mounts to be aware of, is that until you get into the astrophysics, Paramount, some of the other ones, Avalon, you know, the high-end ones usually will actually give you a rating for your imaging capacity, but some of the lower-end ones, like the Celestron and the Orion, lower-end by cheaper, I mean, some of them will give you a capacity, but it's actually a visual capacity or observing capacity. So they might tell you on your Sirius that you can carry 30 pounds, but really, you know, I've always heard the golden rule of don't go past 50% of the observing capacity with your imaging weight, and yeah, that's a really good safe rule. You can push it a little bit depending on how your mount performs. You might get up to 60, 70. Some people I know work at 80 or 90% even of the capacity, but I think that that's rare and it causes more issues and a little more heartache. It's harder to get repeatability. And so when you're looking at these mounts, the reason they cost more is because, well, they work better, they work more reliably, and they carry the load better. And really, when you get going in astrophotography, what you really want is a mount that you don't have to think about. And until you get up into sort of the astrophysics world, or the $4,000 or $5,000 mounts, maybe some of the Avalons, the Paramount, I think the MIT just came out. You know, those are the ones that you start running with, and hopefully you just don't have to think about your mount anymore. It tracks and guides very well for you, and it's not an issue anymore. Anybody who gets going in astrophotography and starts with a Sirius or an Atlas or an AVX, they can tell you, well, they played around with their mount a lot, whether it's learning how to balance them, learning how to mesh them, learning how to guide better with them, whatever have you. It's just something to think about, and we can go into more detail on that. Okay, and Glenn brings up a good point. People talk about how much to spend on which part of your gear, and the mount, and so maybe I haven't made it clear, the mount is the foundation of everything you do in astrophotography. And you know, I would highly recommend, and I think most people would highly recommend who are in the hobby, spend as much as you can on your mount, and upgrade the rest of your gear as you can go on, because without a good mount, you could have a $10,000 camera and a $20,000 telescope, and you'll never get a decent picture because you just can't track the sky. So yes, I would highly recommend, as Glenn pointed out, to spend more on your mount than your OTA. And if possible, maybe even spend as much on your mount as your OTA and your camera combined. I would say that I'm halfway to that. I probably have spent about the same on each of them. I think I have, maybe my camera's a little bit more now, but I've also done a lot of work on my mount and modifying it to perform better. And if you look through the old Astro Imaging channel sessions, we did a whole session on mounts where we talked about a bunch of different kinds of mounts, and I'm not an expert on many of them except for the Atlas, which is the one that I've used a lot, as well as the Sirius. So, like I said, I think it may be three or four sessions back, but go back and look at that. That's a really good one if you're actually trying to decide which mount you want to get. We go through the pros and cons of the hardware, the software, the performance, the costs, and pretty much everything in between. And we will probably have another one as more of these new mounts are released. So again, just emphasize that the mount is definitely the foundation in imaging. So when you go on a forum or you ask somebody in your local astronomy club, what to spend money on, if they tell you a mount and they tell you to make sure you're getting a great mount, then believe them. And if they tell you don't worry about it, then maybe you shouldn't believe them. So moving on. We'll go to OTAs or lenses. So there's a lot to pick from. You're just getting going. A lot of people right off the bat want to get a big giant SCT mounted on a Celestron AVX, and part of it is the marketing. The marketing makes it seem like just a wonderful combo. It's usually a pretty good and reasonable deal, and it's exciting to get a super long focal length and think you're going to see a galaxy up close and personal, but very, very rarely works that way. I wouldn't say it can't be done, and I've seen people do it, but it's maybe 90% of the time doesn't work well for people off the bat, and 80% of the time it might make people quit because they just can't get it working right, they get frustrated, and they just had enough, so they move on. So when you're shopping, you may hear about a refractor, which has a series of glass lenses, and they actually reflect the light. A Dobsonian, and usually those are used more for visual use, but as I mentioned before, some people will hook up webcams to them, and some people even try to modify them for deep sky objects, but they're not typically used very much for deep sky imaging. Schmidt-Cassegrains are usually used for pretty long focal length stuff, or I believe that now they're using Hyperstar on them for shorter focal length and very fast speeds, but they're tough to start with. You have to deal with issues like mirror flops sometimes, and learning how to guide with one so that you don't have the mirror moving while you're trying to guide. But I won't go too much into that so I don't confuse the matter. There's Ritchie-Creightons, which I have a picture of right here, and that has a primary mirror in the back of the telescope, a secondary up in the front, and then it reflects light back out the back again towards your camera. A lot of times these are also used for pretty long focal lengths, and the Hubble Space Telescope actually uses a version of a Ritchie-Creighton telescope. So there's a lot good about them, and they've actually become very affordable here recently with the introduction of the Astrotech Ritchie-Creightons. A lot of times they're also labeled, I think Telescope Service has one, TPO has one, and there might be another company or two. I think that Orion at one point was selling Ritchie-Creighton, but they're all pretty much the same telescope, just sold under different names. And they're not the easiest telescope to start with, or even the easiest one to use once you get going. You have to worry about collimating it, and that's, it's a challenge. It takes some work to learn how to collimate your telescope, and also imaging at those long focal lengths, it can be harder to guide. One thing that is hopefully coming out soon new are some improved imaging Newtonians. There's some imaging Newtonians out there that are good, but they're very expensive. I think $3,000, $4,000, $5,000. maybe even more. Some of them are $7,000 or $10,000, and then you have some cheaper versions, which a lot of people produce good images with. I think that they're one of the common scopes to start with. Like you might use like a 6-inch or 8-inch Orion imaging Newtonian. They're good because they're very fast, and they have a uh, good aperture, so you're going to get a lot of light in at once. And they're good value. They're usually pretty inexpensive. They're especially inexpensive whenever you compare it to refractors or even Ritchie Creightons or some of the Schmidt-Cassegrains or astrographs. And I'll get into astrographs in a minute. But the imaging Newtonians are a good way to get started. Once you start trying to image for longer, or take higher quality images, then you might struggle some with ones that are cheaper and on the market today because of flexure in your focuser or a little bit of your mirror shifting. um, but they're not bad. They're a pretty good value to start with. However, as I mentioned, Astrotech is supposed to be developing some and coming out with some this year that are truss tube imaging newts, and we have high hopes for them. As I mentioned, if you don't know what speed is, your F ratio, it has a big impact on how much light you collect and how quickly you collect that light, and they are very fast. So if somebody can come out with an affordable, very high quality imaging Newtonian for under a couple $1,000s, then it could be something that is a game changer. You have to deal with coma. There are coma correctors that I think will give you a pretty flat field, but if you don't use one right off the bat, you're going to have issues with your stars not being round all the way across the field. And the other thing, especially if you get up to an 8 or 10-inch imaging Newtonian, when you're trying to guide with it, they are big. Just by the fact that they are big, they're harder to guide with, not only because they're big and they can be heavier, but also because there's wind. And if you even have a small amount of wind, maybe 10, 15 miles an hour, good luck trying to guide with that. That's tough enough with a small little refractor to guide in winds like that. But if you have what a lot of people refer to as a giant sail, then you're really going to struggle with it. Astrographs is kind of a generic term, and it's, I think, usually just used to describe a telescope that is made for imaging. So there's a bunch of different kind of astrographs, and there's imaging newts that are called astrographs. There's RC, I think the AT8 RC that Ritchie Creighton is called an astrograph. There's refractors that have flatteners built in that are called astrographs. A lot of the times, astrographs are made purposely for imaging, so they aren't always the best scope for doing visual work. So you may have issues coming to focus with an eyepiece when you're trying to use an astrograph for visual work. However, the positive side is that it's easier to come to focus with the astrograph with your camera. And the reason is that there's a focal plane, where your image comes to focus. And with the astrographs, it is made in a comfortable location for your camera, so that you're not having to use tons of extensions or having issues, coming to focus. With the RCs, it's a little bit of an exception. You do have to use extensions on the RCs, but as you can see in this crazy setup, part of the extensions that are used are big, sturdy, threaded connections, and it's kind of one of the positive things about the way that they look at it is that it gives you plenty of room to actually put gears and accessories in between. So, like I said, astrographs are basically scopes that are made for imaging. And then I want to touch on camera lenses. So camera lenses are really probably one of the best ways to get into the hobby. A lot of people who want to get into astrophotography have done a little bit of work with DSLRs or whatever kind of camera they have, but they've got lenses. They might have just a really short, like 50mm lens. They might have a really nice lens because they're into birding, or they might take pictures of athletic events or whatever they take pictures of. But it's just a really great way to get into astrophotography, especially if you have the camera and lens already. It really will soften the blow expense-wise to get into the hobby. And you can use a lens. Usually you can actually use a camera lens with either a CCD camera or a DSLR camera, which we will go into in just a minute. But I'm not an expert on lenses. Jerry Lodegriffs has a big table on his website. I think it's called Catching the Light is his website. But if you look through there, he has a big table where he compares all kinds of different lenses. I know, for example, that some people use the 50 nifty lens to really great success. And also the thing to think about with lenses is there's not a lot of really short telescopes. This picture of the Stellar View 50 ED Apo is pretty much the widest field telescope that you can get on the market, and that was even discontinued. So lenses are a great way to take really wide field shots. For example, some of the pictures, if you look on Astrobin or Flickr or wherever you look for your pictures, have been like the Witch's Head Nebula or even Comet Lovejoy. If you have a 50 millimeter lens, you could go out and take a couple of 20 or 30 second exposures right now, and you could get a picture that has 3 or 4 really interesting deep sky objects. You can get Comet Lovejoy, and you can get the Pleiades, and you can actually even get a little bit of the Intergalactic Flux Nebula in there if you have something that's fast enough. And so that brings me into talking about how fast the lenses are. That's another thing that you won't get in most telescopes. A lot of the lenses operate down, you might want to use them at f2.8 or f4 or f5, but really that's a lot faster than almost any telescope you're going to buy. So not only is it forgiving because you're using a short focal length, it's easy to guide with it. You might not even have to guide if you're only taking 20, 30, or minute-long exposures. Sorry, 20 or 30 seconds or minute-long exposures. You might not have to guide, but even if you do, you don't have to guide very well with the short focal lengths. It's pretty easy to get nice round stars, and you can get a lot of data with the fast lenses. And I won't go too much into the math, but just to think about how f ratios work for people who don't know, it's the relative time needed to image is the f ratio squared of the scope you're using over the f ratio squared of the faster optics. So just as a small example, if you're using big Schmidt Cassegrain at f10 and then you're using a lens at f2, and while we know that there's not very many lenses that are f2 that have the same aperture, but for comparison's sakes, if you're at f10 compared to f2, then it's 10 squared over 2 squared, so it's 100 over 4, which means that you need to image for 25 times as long to get the same amount of light. So just a quick example of showing how fast lenses can actually help you out. Some of the other easy starting gears are small refractors, and there's more and more really nice small refractors coming on the market now. A lot of people start off with an Orion 80 ED or a Stellar View 80 millimeter ST. Now they have the AT65 EDQ, and that's an Astrotech telescope, and it has a built-in flattener for it. And so we haven't got there yet, but we'll get there hopefully at some point here before too long. Talking about the peripherals, you might need reducers or flatteners or correctors of some type on a lot of telescopes, but some of these new ones like the AT65 EDQ or the new William Optics Star 71, some of the other William Optics 5-element scopes all have flatteners built into them. Even some of the upper scale ones like the SVQ100 or the TOC 106 FSQ, those are ones that are really great because you don't have to worry about anything extra to get into to get a nice flat field. So just talking quickly about the different kind of scopes you might see when you're shopping. There's a doublet, there's a triplet, an apo, and a quad. Usually an apo is referenced as something that has very good color correction, no chromatic aberrations, so that your stars will all sort of come to focus at about the same point. All your colors will come to focus at about the same size, so you don't have big giant halos around your stars when you're imaging. Oftentimes doublets are not very well color corrected, so if you're doing one-shot color imaging, then you might get big blue or violet halos around your stars. Most triplets, depending on the kind of glass that they have, are usually pretty well color corrected. And I won't spend too long on it, but if you're looking for a high quality telescope to start with, look for one that has a glass called FPL53. That's the kind of glass that you want in your scope if you're looking for a high quality glass. It's sharper optics and better color correction on them. So I'm going to move on to get through everything tonight. Just kind of quickly to go through different kinds of imaging cameras. You might want to start with a DSLR, you might use a webcam, or you might use a CCD. The DSLRs are a great way to start if you have them on hand already, and people take a lot of very stunning images with DSLRs. So if you have a nice Canon or a Sony or a Nikon, don't think that you necessarily have to go out and buy a new camera for doing deep sky imaging. Webcams, typically webcams can be used for guiding, or they could be used even for taking images, and usually they're used if you're imaging for planetary work or lunar work, so not as much for deep sky astrophotography. And I am going to move on now to some of the things you can do for DSLRs that are really great. Are astromodifying it. So you see pictures of these really beautiful red nebula, and you think, you know, how are people getting pictures of those? So with the DSLR, the red nebula are actually usually coming from hydrogen alpha, which is an emission line of deep red that's just outside of the visible spectrum, or kind of bordering on the visible spectrum. And because of that, they're actually usually cut out of your regular DSLR. There's a filter in them that keeps that red light from coming in, that deep red light. And the reason is, if it's not there, then it'll actually overwhelm your pictures and they'll look a lot more red. So when you're doing astrophotography, a lot of people will actually remove that IR cut filter. You can do this yourself. There's tons of tutorials online, or you can have somebody else do it for you. There's quite a few guys out there who will actually, if you send your camera to them, they'll remove the filter for you, and it just makes imaging the hydrogen alpha so much easier. There's, you know, I won't say it can't be done, but it pretty much can't be done, getting that really nice hydrogen alpha. There's a few guys here who have very sensitive cameras, and if they go to dark sites, they can get the hydrogen alpha, especially on really bright ones. But if you're going for faint targets, then it's very challenging. Some of the brighter ones, like the Pelican Nebula, the North American Nebula, maybe even the California Nebula and the Rosette, you can get some of the hydrogen alpha from them. But once you start going after some seriously faint HA stuff, you're just really fighting an uphill battle. So once you get that IR cut filter, though, then it opens up the ability to do narrowband work with your DSLR. If you put a hydrogen alpha filter on there, you can cut out all the other light, and you can get only the hydrogen alpha data. And it's not the most efficient way, because your camera has an RGB Bay array, and so only 1 pixel in 4 is red, so you're only going to be getting 1/4 of the resolution and sort of the sensitivity. It's kind of made up for a little bit by the interpolation algorithm, but it's just not as good. So the next step, if you really want to stick with the DSLR, is you can modify it. And I played around with a modified DSLR for a while, and that's where somebody actually will go in, or you will go in, and you scrape the Bayer array off of your sensor. Your sensor is made up with a bunch of little red, green, and blue filters over them and micro lenses. And what they do is they actually filter out all the other light but the red, the green, or the blue from each little square in your sensor. And this would be a good thing to Google if you're interested in it. Look at how a RGB Bayer array works. But once you scrape that off, that means all the light coming into your sensor looks the same to your sensor. So you are now imaging at monochrome. Once you do this, though, you will need filters. And it was definitely a fun experiment for me for a while, and it increased the resolution quite a bit. It sort of increases the sensitivity and decreases it at the same time, because you're increasing the sensitivity because you're not going through all the filters, but you are decreasing the sensitivity because there are micro lenses that were scraped off of the sensor. So those micro lenses do a good job of capturing photons that would be landing between your pixels and redirecting them at your pixels. So when you do that, I can't remember what the exact number was, but you're losing 10 to 15% efficiency in your sensor by getting rid of those micro lenses. However, you can make up for it some because you're not filtering out the other channels. But then another thing you can do if you really want to stick down this DSLR route is you can do tech cooling. So when you do this, you are actually cooling the sensor itself. For a while, it was pretty challenging to get this to work right, and people had to experiment. And that was maybe up till 3 or 4 years ago that no one really got a great job of it. They were maybe building cooler boxes outside their camera. But recently, people have done a better job of actually cooling the sensor itself through a cold finger, a piece of metal that actually goes over to your sensor and attaches to it and cools it down. And this is something that a lot of people do on their own now. But you can also purchase them from a number of websites. There's Central DS, JTW Astronomy, and I think there's a couple other ones. I don't know. I don't think Hap Griffin does it, but there might be a couple other people who actually do the cooling. Hap Griffin, by the way, is one of the guys who will do your astro modification to the camera, except for the cooling. And I can't remember all the others. I'm a little tongue-tied at the moment. If people want to list them in chat, I will bring up the other people who do your astro modifications to the DSLRs. But so there's a lot you can do with the DSLR, and typically, even for the great ones, you're still running it under $2,000. As you can see, and I'll touch on this now because the picture's right here, the one problem if you get into a cooled, modified, astro-modified DSLR is there's a lot to adapt to get it to work right. And you can see all these little adapters and this weird spacing that took me forever to figure out, and I had to go in and measure everything with calipers and test and then adjust and then test and adjust. And I finally got it to the point where I was running this on both my Stellar View and my AT8RC. So it is possible to make these setups work, but they are definitely a lot more work. So moving on to CCDs, I'll just kind of briefly go through some of the names of the companies and things to consider. There's SBIG, ATIC, QSI, FLI, QHY, Starlight Express. I didn't mention Celestron. Orion makes a couple of cameras, Apogee, and then there's a couple other ones. But so those are some of the names to look at. But the important thing to think about is the considerations whenever you're picking your camera. You want to know how far it cools and if it has set point cooling. Set point cooling is really great if you want to build a dark library and actually match your darks to your lights. It's more efficient, or it's easier to do it that way than trying to put it in the fridge and set the temperature of your fridge. Another consideration is the quantum efficiency of the chip, and your camera doesn't actually have a single quantum efficiency. It has kind of a spectrum of quantum efficiency depending on which bandwidth of light you're actually imaging, and it usually looks a little bit like a lopsided bell curve. For example, a lot of the new Sony sensors have a much higher quantum efficiency than some of the older Kodak chips. and it can make a big difference in how quickly you're actually picking up signal. When you're picking out a camera, you want to look at the noise characteristics. And I won't go at all into that. We did a whole astro imaging session a while back on noise characteristics, and they can be quite overwhelming. There's a lot to learn, but the lower the dark noise and the lower the read noise, the better. Again, Sony's pretty much got the ticket to the the best performance in both of these. I will mention that trade-off is they have a smaller field of view. And saying Sony sensors, I'm talking about stuff like the ICX694 sensor and the 814 sensor. So there's a couple of them. You can Google them to see what I'm talking about. Another thing to think about when you're picking your camera is whether you want mono or one-shot color. Another thing, and some people love the integrated filter wheel and integrated off-axis guider. I really like the small package of the QSI, and it's all built together. I know that some other people in our forums like those to be separated and like to kind of fiddle with each of them independently. I won't speak to the reasons why they do, but you'll have to kind of look at them yourself and decide yourself why you like them. Another big one to think about, though, is the size of the filters used with the camera. I know a lot of the S-Big cameras use the 36 millimeter filters, and some of them use the 31 millimeter filters, but that makes a huge difference. If you're loading up your filter wheel with Astrodon filters, and especially the narrowband 3 nanometer ones, you might end up spending an extra $1,500 or maybe even more to go from the 1 1/4 inch filters up to the 36 millimeter filters. And on the same chip, even QSI will use smaller filters because they had it closer to the sensor. So it's definitely a big thing to consider. Adam brings up another good point. The weight is worth considering. There are some older cameras, and there's even some newer cameras that are very heavy. And for a lot of people like to really push their images, they're trying to take really long exposures. And focusers have a hard time holding the camera. Not only do they have a hard time holding the camera in the same position because they're so heavy, they have a hard time holding the camera orthogonal to your optical tube, whatever you're using. And if your camera is not orthogonal to your tube, you're not going to get round stars across your field of view, and you're not going to be in focus across your field of view. So that's another kind of nice thing about the little QSI camera. And again, this is just, I'm talking about what I use because I have them. That it's a little bit lighter. Some of the ATIC cameras, the new ATIC ones, have everything built in and they're super lightweight. They're working toward, I think most of the camera makers are working towards getting smaller and more compact as much as possible and reducing weight as much as possible. One thing I won't go into too much is blooming or anti-blooming. And essentially just roughly, blooming is whenever you load up one of your pixels with too many photons and it starts spilling over into the photons next door. And if you don't have anti-blooming, sometimes you will get these big giant streaks coming off of your bright stars, and they can be very hard to process out. I think most of the cameras available today now do have anti-blooming technology. There's some older cameras, I think, especially S-Big had some older cameras. I'm not sure about other companies that did not have anti-blooming technology in them. However, one of the things that was a positive without the anti-blooming technology was that they were much, much more efficient. I think maybe up to 70 and 80%. Another couple things to think about that are important are manufacturing location and customer service. Most of these companies do a pretty good job of building their cameras, and they'll work well most of the time, but I think anybody who's in the hobby for long enough is going to have a camera issue and is going to need work on it. Whether they have to do the work themselves or they have to send it in to get work done on it, it's really nice knowing that the camera you spent a lot of money on and you really care about having up and running for those few clear nights we get a year is going to be taken care of well and taken care of in a hurry. So, you may want to think about buying, if you live in America, you might want to buy a camera made in America, or at least that has a certified repair shops in America. It's a big deal, so that you don't have to ship it overseas. And that actually has to do with all of your gear, whether it's a mount or a telescope or whatever. If you buy something from out of the country, just realize if something's wrong, you have to send it back or you have to purchase it again. Then, I'm sorry, if you have to send it back or ship it back and forth, it can take a long time and can be very expensive. So it's definitely something to think about, and ask people what they think about both the quality of the gear and the quality of the customer service. SBIG, for example, was just purchased recently, and I think everyone's waiting waiting to see how that's going to affect the customer service. There's a lot of excitement that it might be a lot better, and there's maybe some concern that it won't be as responsive, which is always going to be the case when there's a change in the ownership. So we'll have to see how it kind of pans out. But I have had to deal with SBIG before, and I've had great customer service. I don't have any more of their equipment anymore, so I don't have to worry about it. But a lot of my good friends and even my dad uses an SBIG, so I hope that they continue to really provide great customer service. Um, so briefly, I'll go into computers and software. You can use a laptop, tablet, mobile device, or whatever for acquisition. For the actual acquisition, you don't need a very powerful laptop at all, no matter what your whole setup is. You just don't need a very powerful laptop. I won't get into remote imaging where you might need better remote capabilities, but typically if you have at least Windows XP or Windows 7, and I think maybe 4 gigabytes of RAM, a little bit of a hard drive, the whole gear, then you should be in good shape. The programs just don't take a lot, but you might want to think about the size of the screen for while you're in the field. I typically have 4 windows, 5 windows open at a time, and I tried a small little 13-inch netbook for a while, which was phenomenal because it had a 15-hour battery life, um, and it was very light and very easy to bring around. But then I had a really hard time actually seeing much and dealing with it in the field. So I went back to using a 15-inch laptop. It's an old Sony Vaio. I think it's 7 years old now or 6 years old, but it keeps on chugging away. There's no issues. You might think about keeping it disconnected from the internet as much as possible. If you get a stable setup running with your software, then you don't want a chance of virus getting in there and causing issues while you're imaging. It's good to turn off your antivirus software because a lot of times those not only to turn it off, but if you're not hooked up to the internet, actually just to delete it. A lot of times those will run in the background, and they might do weird things to your computer in the background, which would affect the performance of your acquisition software. So really, best case scenario, you get a really stable setup in your laptop that you're using for acquisition, disconnect it from the internet, and just leave it be. Let it be stable. If stuff is running and it's fine, there's no need to update it. You might be able to run for 3 or 4 years off of the same setup. So I'll touch sort of briefly on post-processing software and acquisition software. For acquisition software, you need something to run your mount. And not always, you might use a hand controller. And for certain mobile setups, you might not need to. But I think the majority of people still are using something to run their mount, whether it's EQMod for the Orions. Astrophysics has their own software. A lot of people use SGP for acquisitions, which is Sequence Generator Pro. Sequence Generator Pro is great because you can run your mount off of it, you can run your camera, you can run your filter wheels, and you can run everything. A lot of times you're going to want a planetarium program. Planetarium program basically shows you what the sky looks like at night and where all the targets are, and it's a great way not only to get to learn the night sky, but to kind of look around at what you want to target for the night. Most of them have a nice setup where you can put your gear in there and you can see what your field of view will be, and you can actually frame your target and see how much of it will fit in there. there's just a lot you can do with them. They're really powerful, and most of them are free. There's Carte de Ciel, I think uh, Starry Sky is one. I know people use a lot of them, but if you just look at planetarium programs on Google, I'm sure you'll find plenty. And then you can ask for advice on which ones people use for different things. Um, More acquisition softwares, ones to run your cameras. I use Nebulosity for ever now, and I still actually use it sometimes as I'm transitioning over to Sequence Generator Pro. If you're a person who likes to use DSLRs, especially Nikons or Canons, there's Backyard EOS and I guess Backyard Nikon now. Again, look back at our sessions. Guylan Roche, I believe, the creator of Backyard EOS and now Backyard Nikon, did a session that will get you up and running with those, and they're really great and very well regarded softwares. They're also very inexpensive. Glenn brings up Stellarium is another planetarium program that a lot of people use with success. Another one, even planning program inside of Sequence Generator Pro, is their Framing and Mosaic Wizard, which is just awesome. It's a really good way to kind of plan your session, especially if you're going to use more than one frame to make a mosaic. But even if you're only doing a one frame shot, I really like the power of it. It's just easy to see what you're going after. Again, another astro imaging channel webinar we did was on selecting your targets and different softwares for selecting your targets. So scroll back to that if you're thinking about what you want to use for that. And the Sky 6 is another planetarium program Tim brings up. So, like I said, again, there's lots out there, and if you go back and look at that presentation, you'll see lots of examples. As far as post-processing software, I'm not going to go into too much depth here because we've pretty much lived in quite a few post-processing software programs here on the Astro Imaging channel. We've used PixInsight. You can use Photoshop. You can even use Nebulosity to some extent. Star Tools is another one, and I think Ivo is the creator of Star Tools. He did a session for us on the Astro Imaging channel, and there's just quite a few of them, and they might range anywhere from $100 to $300 or $350, maybe $400. I think is what PixInsight is running at right now. Photoshop, I don't think you can buy anymore. It's the Creative Cloud Suite, which you can get for $10 to $20 a month, depending on how much you want. A lot of people say, which one do you use or which one do you need? And like I said earlier, the best processors I know use all of them and combine the best of all of them together. David says PixInsight is $285 at the moment, $285. A lot of people who've processed for a while would say if they only had to pick one, they would pick PixInsight. If you haven't used anything before, PixInsight might have a little bit of a steep learning curve, but it might not be that steep compared to Photoshop if you haven't used any of them before. But it's very powerful, and it's made specifically for astrophotography. So there's just tons of tools that can be used. Star Tools is another one. Yes. But so PixInsight is a great one, and if you had to pick only one, I might be leaning more towards that. However, I spent my entire astrophotography career in Photoshop up until recently, and I was quite pleased with all of the processing I did. I got PixInsight because I wanted to expand my skill set and expand the quality of my final images, but there's nothing wrong with Photoshop if you already have it, because you do other photo editing. You can do really great things in it, and you can pretty much do all of the same things you can do in PixInsight, pretty much all of them. Sometimes they might take more steps or might be a little more convoluted to get there, but there's it won't hold you back for a long time if you're just getting going in astrophotography. There's plenty you can do. The one thing Photoshop will not do in the post-processing is actually calibrate your data or stack your data, and put your subs together for you. So PixInsight is good because it can do all of that for you. Nebulosity can as well. Deep Sky Stacker is a free one that can actually stack all of your images for you. But there's quite a few out there. So it's just another thing that you want to make sure you're thinking about when you're picking out all your programs and your hardware and your software, is that the software is a really important part of astrophotography, and you will spend a lot more time inside of your software than you will actually outside under the skies trying to make nice images. So again, I highly recommend spending a little money on these programs and getting to know them well, because 90% of what makes your images good, maybe not 90, but a lot of what makes your images good is spending the time learning how to process them. And that's why we have all these webinars. I mean, we have barely scratched the surface on image processing with all of these shows we've done. And you can just you can spend your whole life becoming a better processor. So it's a big thing to think about. So I want to stop real quick. I know we're running a little late tonight. Make sure there's no questions. Adam, any questions in here?
I haven't seen any more questions. No.
Okay. So I'll try and get briefly through the last few slides here. So I made a big deal about adapters, and you can't forget about adapters when you're trying to put together your setup. You have to connect your camera to your telescope somehow. You have to connect your telescope to your mount somehow. You have to connect your guide cam to your telescope somehow. And when I'm talking about adapters, I've listed mostly metal hardware, but you have to think about cables and stuff too. But I'm going to focus on this for just a little bit here because it really is important, and it's something that I think that anybody who's not in astrophotography could never believe how complicated adapters can be. If you're using a field flattener or focal reducer, or your imaging train requires a certain distance to come to focus or to get a flat field, sometimes you need to make sure you have the right length adapter by 0.5 millimeter to get a really sharp field of stars, and you might have to go from an M48 down to a 1.25 inch thread at 49.7 millimeters to make it work right. You might need to go from a T thread up to a 2-inch thread. You might need to go from some sort of compression ring to an M48, and then from an M48 up to an M68. It is probably the maybe, I don't want to say the most painful things, but it's one of the most frustrating things in astrophotography, is just the slew of all these adapters and the fact that you have to test to see that you get your spacing right. You need to get out and you have to use your clear sky time to actually test the distance on your adapters and make sure it's right. And if it's not right, you might have to go back and order one from across the country. Even if it's only a little $5 adapter, you might have to order one and have it sent all the way across the country until you can even image again. And it can be very frustrating. So, the other thing is that so many astrophotography setups are very unique. So it might be hard to actually go onto a forum and say, hey, I have this telescope and this focal reducer and this camera and this filter wheel. Can you guys tell me what I need to make it work? Well, sometimes we can because we have exactly the same things, but most times we don't. And you have to test it. You have to figure out how to make it all work out. And it's one of actually, while it's one of the frustrating things, it's also one of the maybe enjoyable, interesting things, is that you're making a system work. You're almost like an engineer putting together a system and making sure it all wants to play nicely together. One thing that once you get going in the hobby, you probably will have a box full of adapters. I have a box that's probably got 30 different length T-ring or T-thread adapters, and then maybe 20 different 2-inch thread adapters, and some compression rings, a bunch of different reducer rings. it's just something that you build up on. And I would recommend, if you're trying to work on spacing, you might want to just start with what is called like a variable adapter. You can get like T-thread adapters that could be spaced anywhere from 7 to 20 millimeters apart. Extending your imaging train by 7 to 20 millimeters. And sometimes when you get those, all they do is they kind of screw and unscrew like a lid, and they'll shorten and lengthen the adapter, and those are really good for figuring stuff like that out. Once you figure it out, you might not want to use a variable adapter, but you'll know what length adapter you need to actually purchase. Um, Again, this is just probably one of the most challenging things when you're first starting in astrophotography, is realizing, hey, I got to get all of this stuff actually together and actually working. Um, so just a quick picture here on my setup. I think I mentioned it before. Using my monocooled DSLR it was a lot of fun because nobody, well, not nobody, but there were very few people. I think maybe even in the world, very few people who were even using a monocooled DSLR at the time I was. And if you wanted to use it with a refractor or Ritchie Creighton to get a flat field, you had to put in some sort of corrector. And to make a corrector work right on your sensor, especially on a big sensor like a DSLR, you have to get your spacing right between the corrector and the camera. And because the DSLR was actually monochrome, I had to put filters in there so that I could actually get color data. To get the filters in there, I had to, put something pretty small in that imaging train because it would take up too much room otherwise. And then on top of it, if you look at the shape of the camera, I have to turn my off-axis guider upside down so that it's not running into my camera. I actually had to go out and purchase, there's not very many flatteners out there, field flatteners out there, that use something besides 55 millimeters of back focus. But I had to go out and get the telescope service 2-inch field flattener, which gave me over 100 millimeters of back focus so that I could fit all of the stuff in there. But at the time, no one I knew had ever done anything like this, so I had to figure out how to make it work. And I don't think that was unique to me. I think a lot of times people want to experiment and they want to make things work, so they have to just test adapters, test accessories to make things work. I know people are trying to make different focusers work. I think Eric talked for a while recently about trying to make a focuser work. I think on Schmidt Cassegrain. I think he was maybe using like a 8-inch or 10-inch HD. So there's just lots of things. Currently, my plan right now is I'm working on actually adapting a Moonlight focus motor to the William Optic Star 71. There's no solution out there right now to actually make it an automated focusing for the William Optic Star 71. I know that Rigel is working on doing that, but I don't think it's working yet, and there's an issue because you can't remove the fine focus knob on there, so you have to find a way to attach the stepper motor to both the telescope and to the focuser focusing knob, and then bring that back to your focus or motor controller. So it's just a lot of things to think about and in adapters. And again, I wanted to spend a little time just to make you realize when you're trying to put your setup together, make sure you ask the right questions and make sure you are willing to experiment and make sure you think about it hard. Maybe the simplest way to get started is to, if you're using a DSLR, is just to get a T-ring and a field flattener. That's the one thing that has been done well over the years, is they've made field flatteners with 55 millimeters of back focus because sorry, they have field flatteners with 55 millimeters of back focus, and then a T-ring which has 11 millimeters of optical train take-up, and then you have 44 millimeters to your sensor. And this is sort of true across all the Canons, and I believe some of the Nikons as well. So that's one of the very few things in astrophotography that kind of has a standard, and it works well. So, so that would be sort of the simplest way to get going on that. talking about mounting hardware, especially for astrophotography, you have to think about what kind of saddles, rings, dovetails, shoes, clamshells, mounting screws, whatever you're going to use to make your setup work. I will just go straight to the what I would recommend, and it would be at least a Lozmindy plate and an ADM Lozmindy saddle because they're wider, they're very well built, and they're very sturdy. And I would get a really nice set of rings. If you get rings with thumb screws in them to try and hold your scope, then they're just not going to hold your scope very still. Astrophysics has some really good plates and dovetails and saddles. I think there's a few more out there. I'm not going to bring them all up, but um, don't skimp out on those. You get the ones that are stocked with an Orion Sirius mount where you're just driving a screw into a dovetail. Um, it doesn't hold it quite as still, and it doesn't hold it quite as solid. And when you're imaging, um, you can tug on your telescope with your hand, and if it doesn't move at all to your eye, it doesn't mean it's not moving at all. It's still moving. And getting the widest, most solid foundation you can to actually set up your telescope on your mount is a big deal. Getting rings that are as robust as possible and aren't going to budge at all whenever you're imaging is definitely a big deal. And you can even talk about so Tim brought up people use side-by-side dual saddles, and so when you think about using a side-by-side saddle or a top-bottom saddle, you have to start thinking about differential flexure if you're using a guide scope on top and a telescope on the bottom, or if you're using two telescopes side by side, there's a thing called differential flexure where the focuser will move microns, maybe just even tenth of a millimeter on one of your scopes compared to the other, and then all of a sudden your stars start trailing. And believe me, if you get going in astrophotography and you do not start off with an off-axis guider, differential flexure is it's at one point gonna drive you absolutely nuts. It's almost impossible to track down. You've got 30 or 40 different little thumb screws between your mount and your telescope and your camera and your guide cam, and you can tighten every single one of them down as much as you can so it's not moving. You can think you got everything perfect, but then you're still going to get the flexure. And I personally will always recommend just going to an off-axis guider. I used to hear rumors when I first started that they were more challenging to use, and I shied away from it, and I wish I hadn't. I probably would have saved 6 months of kind of troubleshooting my imaging if I had gone straight to an off-axis guider. I will point out, if you're imaging at very long focal lengths and you're using a less quantum efficient guide cam, then it's going to be challenging. If you try to put a Starshoot auto guider on a off-axis guider and you're shooting at 2,000 millimeter focal length, then you're going to have a hard time finding guide stars. But if you're shooting at 1,000 or 1,300 or 700 millimeters or shorter, and you have something like the QH5L2 mono camera, then you're going to find plenty of guide stars to guide on. So, unless you're going straight to 2,000 millimeters, I always recommend getting an off-axis guider. There's so many out there to choose from that are very high quality. For a lot of setups, the new Orion Thin off-axis guider is pretty good. Unless your camera's really heavy, it's just a nice solid off-axis guider, and it takes up so little room in your imaging train or your optical train that it doesn't really cause spacing issues like a lot of them do. And this is, of course, assuming that you don't have a CCD camera with a integrated off-axis guider. So again, just adapters are a big deal. I know I said that about a lot of things tonight, but there's a lot of things that are a big deal. And they, as you see, there's a lot of things you have to think about in astrophotography to get your whole system working correctly together. So I'll just move on from that into peripherals and all the other things you need to think about. Hopefully it's not too overwhelming yet. But focusers. A lot of us will spend as much money on a focuser as we do on a telescope these days. If you look at, there's a picture of the Moonlight 2.5-inch motorized focuser, and people think, oh, is it really that big of a deal? Can I just use the stock focuser on my telescope? And I'd say most of the time, no. Unless you have a very light camera, or you're doing short exposures, or your standards, aren't super high. You could start with it. You can always start with it, and I always recommend experimenting, trying stuff for yourself to find out. Go ahead and get that telescope with the stock focuser and try and shoot with it. And if it doesn't work, then you can replace the focuser. Moonlight is one of the companies. Feather Touch makes some. Optic makes some. I'm not sure. There's a couple other companies that make them, but those are really the big focuser replacement companies. Like I said, I mean, most of the time you're going to want to end up replacing your focuser. I will say I was pleasantly surprised with the new William Optics Star 71 focuser. It's quite solid, and it seemed to do a pretty good job at holding the focus and not getting any sag. But unfortunately, as I mentioned, it also is really hard to put some sort of motor on. It's the first of the William Optics focusers I've used that I've been really happy with. Stellar View's coming out with some 2.5 and 3-inch versions of their focusers, and I think that they're getting to be higher quality. A lot of companies are trying, with nice telescopes like Astrophysics, are trying to put higher and higher quality focusers on there. But most of the time, it seems like people still end up putting a Moonlight or a Feather Touch focuser on their telescopes. I'm not going to say it's an absolute requirement, but it's the way that a lot of people go. So moving on from focusers, talk about filter wheels. If you don't get one integrated into your camera, you need to get a filter wheel. You need to think about the spacing. You need to think about the adapters you need. You have to go from your off-axis guider to your filter wheel to your camera. And that's part of why I really like the integrated package. And maybe it's because I spent so long working on that DSLR setup that was so complicated, is because now I just have one that just works off the bat. But if you get them separate, the filter wheel and the off-axis guider, you have to figure out the spacing between them. You even have to start thinking about your light path and making sure that you're not going to get vignetting or light cutoff, because maybe your off-axis guider goes down to a 42 millimeter opening or a 36 millimeter opening, and then you open it back up to 48 millimeters for your filter wheel. Well, if you went down to 36 millimeters, closer to the telescope, then that's all you get for the rest of the way in to your sensor. And if your sensor is a big one and you cut down to 36 millimeters, way up right next to your telescope, then you might not get all the light in there. So that's another thing to think about, is making sure that your light path is little vignetting as possible. Then you want to think about actually reaching focus. So you can think about that with your focuser by motorizing it and using some kind of special software. You can use routines and nebulosity or SGP to actually find the sharpest focus point. They have routines built into those programs. I believe Backyard EOS does as well. I think Maxim does. But if you're just out there and really want to get sharp focus manually, you can use a batten-off mask. To this day, even with my automatic focuser or motorized focuser, I still usually use the batten-off mask, and I just use my hand controller on my focuser until I have my gear set up more permanently. That's kind of what I found is the quickest and easiest way to do it. And that batten-off mask, you can see I'm holding in my hand there, creates an interesting diffraction pattern in a star where you've got an X with a vertical line running through it, and you want to center the vertical line in the X. And that's how you know you reach focus, when that vertical line makes it to the middle of the X, and it'll kind of go back and forth from one side to the other until you found focus. So you just do a series of short exposures to see where that line is, and you rack your focuser in and out until you find focus. So that's another thing you have to think about, and you have to have. Focus is very critical. Again, like everything else, without a way to get really sharp focus, even if you have a great mount and great telescope and great camera and great everything, if you're not in good focus, then your images will never look good. They'll be soft. You won't get any detail. If you don't have sharp images, you're not going to be able to gather a lot of photons in a very efficient manner, so you're going to have a lot of noise. It's just it's an absolute must to be in great focus when you're taking astro images, whether you're using a lens, a refractor, an RC, or whatever you're using. Um, and then you need some way to take flats. And I won't go into what calibration frames are too much here. If you just search calibration frames, you'll know that there's biases, there's dark frames, there's flats, there's flat darks. But flats are very important to getting high quality images. Basically, they can make a map of the vignetting in your system. They can make a map of where the dust motes are in your sensor and your optical train, and they can correct your images for them. A lot of people can take sky flats. They might, which would be putting like a T-shirt over the end of your tube and shooting at a blank space in the sky right at dusk or dawn. A lot of people use a television screen or a white screen or an iPad screen. I'd like to build a light box with a electroluminescent panel, and the reason that I do that is that I know I'm getting very pure white light. I can control the brightness of it, and I have little adapters built to actually fit right over the end of my scope. Again, adapters to go from my light box to my different scopes. They're really important. So you don't have to use a light box, but if you really want good images, you need to use flats. And a light box is probably the best way to get them. Filters, something we haven't even really touched on besides the size of them, but even if you have one-shot color camera, if you're shooting at home and you've got a lot of light pollution, there's probably 20 different kinds of light pollution filters to think about. You have to make sure that you have the right size light pollution or right size filter to fit in your camera. You have to make sure that you have a way to actually attach it to your camera or to your optical train. Then you have to start shopping about what the different kinds of light pollution filters do and what kind of light they cut. For example, there's the Astronomic CLS, and then there's the Astronomic CLS CCD. The CLS is used if you're not going to have ultraviolet and infrared coming through. If you are, and you're using refractive optics, then you want to use the CLS CCD. However, these aren't great for shooting galaxies, but they're good for shooting nebula because they're very aggressive in their cut. So if you want to shoot galaxies, you might want to think about the IDIS LP4 filter, or sorry, the LP4 or the LP2 filter. The IDIS LP2 lets in a lot more light across the spectrum, and it's not quite as an aggressive a cut. But if you want a more aggressive cut, again for nebulas from IDIS, you go to the LP4. So you have to think about how these filters work. If you're using monochrome cameras, there's a couple different companies to choose from to pick your LRGB filters, and you kind of want to think about whether they're parafocal or not, meaning that they'll come to focus at the same point, so you don't have to change focus between different filters. And then you have to think about whether or not they have good anti-reflective coatings, so you're not getting big halos on your stars. And how expensive they are. You have to trade them off. Vaders are up there as pretty high quality, but Astrodon clearly kind of live in a league of their own with filters. And then you could also get astronomic filters, which are maybe sort of in the same league as Vaders. Then once you get to narrowband, you have a whole world of learning about different bandwidths, whether you're getting a Vader 7 nanometer HA filter or Astrodon 3 nanometer HA filter, or you want to get a 5 nanometer because you want to include the HA and the N2 in it. There's just a lot to think about in the filters and what you actually need in them. And then you can actually even use UHC filters, which basically let in different narrowband spectrum lights and small swatches of the narrowband spectrums, but at the same time, so that you can shoot nebulas and only get data from nebulas instead of getting a lot of light pollution. So again, if you live in heavy light pollution, it's definitely something you have to think about. You're not going to really be able to get very good images in heavy light pollution. without some sort of filter system, whether it's LRGB or light pollution or narrowband. Another thing to think about, especially if you live in a place that's got a lot of moisture, is dew heaters. Where I live in Pennsylvania, if I don't use dew heaters, I typically won't make it through a night. My glass will be covered in dew. Usually by the time that I leave, I bring a couple towels with me and I wipe every single thing down before I pack up. Even if I'm at home, I have to do that because everything is completely covered in dew. I was down in Florida about a month ago, and it was as bad as I've ever seen, where it pretty much looked like somebody hosed down my gear because there was so much dew all over the place. So, again, it's one of those things where if you go out for a night and you got 99 things, and then there's one thing that you didn't bring, like your dew heater, you could be out for the night. Another thing that people will do is bring little 12-volt hair blow dryers to heat up their lenses in case the dew gets out of control and they need to make it go away. And you might have to heat up the window covering your sensor in your camera to actually get to keep on imaging. So just another little peripheral thing that you need to think about and could kill your session if it just keep you from imaging. And I won't go into automation gear too much. We did another session and webinar on automation gear, talking about different things that you can do to automate. And next week, Mike Miller will be talking about doing stuff, doing remote imaging. So he'll go into great depth on that. But if that's something that you're into, it's something that you should definitely think about. And then finally, shelter. There's a lot more to go over, but we'll end it with shelter. And the reason I say shelter is light pollution, wind, your neighbor's lights, direct lights, they're all issues. And maybe even animals in your yard. In my backyard, deer are always walking up and very curious about what I'm doing outside in my driveway. So sometimes I will actually put part of this little panel box thing I've built, it's called a skybox. I'll put that around my gear, but always at star parties, if I'm going out, I'll do that. If I go out and do remote imaging, I might put like a little two-sided panel in front of my telescope so that the wind doesn't affect it much. But if it starts getting windy at all, even with the smaller telescopes, your guiding can be affected quite a bit, and it might be really hard to guide. So you want to think about how to block the lights if you're in your own house or in your yard somewhere and your neighbor's got a light 50 yards away shining towards you. You need to block it. It'll definitely show up in your images. So just another thing to think about. There's a lot more in the peripherals, but I feel like I've done a pretty good job covering almost everything that needs to be thought about. Another thing that I will do after the session tonight is I will upload a spreadsheet that I created, and I need to get a few more things in it to share with you before uploading it. But I will just give you a quick glimpse of what it looks like. And basically, what I have is a couple of complete setups from the ground up, put into spreadsheet form, including prices, links to the websites where they're at, and it's basically a full setup thinking about adapters that are needed, batteries, power supplies, telescopes, everything we went over tonight, and it'll be literally everything you need to get going. And I'm going to cover setups from $1,500 all the way up to $10,000+ in this, and we don't have much time to go over it tonight, but I'll definitely post this, and it'll be a kind of a good reference for people if you're thinking about getting into astrophotography or trying to build another setup. Just making sure that you're actually thinking of what you're actually wanting to get into. Adam, I can ask you if I should keep going or if I should pause. I know that tonight ran a little bit long, but there was one other topic that we did want to cover that Glenn brought up. Should we save that for another night or keep going tonight?
The topic of planets, DSO, wide field, etc.
Yes, I think we got into it a little bit, talking about dogs and refractors and lenses.
Yeah, we could talk on it for a few minutes, and then open up the discussion. A Yeah, a lot of what we do is DSO based, I think, but you can at least touch on it just so people know that if they do want to do planets, it's not going to cost them quite as much.
Right. So I mentioned this before a little bit earlier. If you want to do planets, there's a lot easier ways to get into it, and it doesn't necessarily have to cost you as much. You can get an Orion Dob and a cheap webcam. Again, this is how I started, and even before I built my equatorial platform. Um, and you can actually take pictures of, Jupiter, Saturn, Mars, the Moon. Um, and I think even the sun, but it's definitely a much cheaper way to get into it. I think my whole setup, you can see the Dove here in the middle of this picture. Uh, I think the whole setup might have cost $600 or $700, including the webcam that I put in there. The software that I got was free to make it happen, and again, I think it's a great way to get started, and it's very cheap, and it'll tell you if you enjoy doing it or not. And so that's one thing to talk about. Deep sky objects, I think we talked about a lot tonight. We talked some about wide field tonight. Talking about camera lenses and DSLRs is a great way to start with wide fields. Another thing that we haven't touched on at all is solar imaging, and I personally have not done any solar imaging, so I won't talk much about it except for that there are certain telescopes that are made. I think Coronado makes them that are specially made for imaging the sun. You can get hydrogen alpha filters that are specifically made for imaging the sun, and take quite a few really short snapshots of them, and I think you can even use a webcam to do that as well. So that's another cheap way to get into it. I think a lot of people who spend much time in planetary, lunar, or solar imaging, who really enjoy it, decide they want more targets to choose from. There's an infinite amount of targets in the night sky, but there's only so many planets, comets, and moons that you can image. So that's why people start moving on from that. The one other thing I wanted to touch on briefly before wrapping it up, that we've talked about sort of imaging based on budget and what you want to shoot, like what kind of objects you want to shoot. But the other big one that we barely touched on was the kind of light pollution you have. If you want to image from home with light pollution, I highly recommend getting a monochrome camera and an HA filter to start. Um, it's it can be very frustrating to see all these great pictures that everybody has out there and just not be able to get anything. But we've talked about light pollution again on the Astro Imaging channel before, and you should read about light pollution before purchasing any kind of setup. If you live in the middle of the city, you're not going to be able to image pretty much anything unless you're using narrowband. So again, I will have a couple notes on that in the spreadsheet that I created that have to do more with what kind of targets you want to shoot and based on where you live and what your light pollution conditions are. But just another thing to think about so that you don't go out and spend a lot of money on gear and then try and shoot from your driveway a mile from the city and wonder why you can't get good images. So I will wrap it up there so that way we can actually open up the discussions. It seems like there's a lot of good chat going on the side here.
Yeah, Josh, it was a great presentation, and I think one of the main points for a newcomer to take out of it is that you should save some budget. We say spend a lot of money on the mount, but anticipate what you can, because you're going to need adapters, you're going to need focal reducers. All that stuff costs money. And we don't know how important money is to you when you're asking questions on the forums. And it's difficult to suggest things. When someone comes in with a $2,000 budget, you could pick out a $2,000 budget setup, but is it a firm $2,000 budget? Are they going to need one more thing that's going to break the bank? So the more you can anticipate, the more you know, the better off you're going to be.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's why I'm looking forward to uploading this spreadsheet for everyone, because you just never know. Like I said, adapters might cost $25 and another $25 to ship it, and you might have spent your whole budget, and then you've got a lot of gear that you'll never be able to use because you spent your whole budget. So when somebody says they can buy a $2,000 camera, well, it might be $2,000 to get the camera, but another $1,500 to get everything to make it work right. So so yeah, the spreadsheet should help a lot because there will be absolutely complete setups. They will cover everything, and then it'll also, more importantly, get you to look at every type of thing that you need to think about for your setup. I see Glenn is talking about robotic telescopes as another approach. If you don't have your own gear and you want to get into processing images, you can download images from some of the NASA telescopes, or you can even rent time on remote telescopes, either to supplement your gear because you can't get the kind of data you want, or just to do on its own. And it might be a way to see if you're interested and you enjoy processing photos.
Yeah, I also had thought we might want to post on cloudy nights in some sort of sticky data, stack data from a DSLR, stack data from a monochrome, because when I first got my monochrome, my data was the first I'd ever seen from a monochrome camera, and sometimes it's nice to see what you're getting into.
I think that's a great idea. Just a raw, stacked, calibrated image of each one, and then maybe some raw data that's not calibrated too. We were talking about the monochrome DSLRs, and at the time I didn't feel like I had the budget to go past that, and I wasn't really quite sure how excited I would be about it. And I think I mentioned it on the thread this week, but the monochrome DSLR was a huge step up from the regular DSLR, and I was stunned by the resolution I was getting and the difference. And I thought, wow, that's really great. And then because of all the adapters and the long imaging train that I needed to make everything work, it was holding me back on which telescopes I could use, which was really the main thing that drove me wanting to get a CCD camera. And I didn't know it or believe it, but when I went from the monochrome cooled DSLR to the CCD camera, the difference was striking. And so I think it would help, put, kind of as you said, a value to the kind of data you're getting, because people ask, is it worth it to spend this much on it? Well, only you know how much your money is worth to you, but you can get some good good empirical data to actually look at yourself to decide, is it worth it to really go from this kind of data to this kind of data for $3,500? Is that worth it to you, or do you want to keep trying to do what you can with your own?
Exactly.
Any other questions or comments? And I was glad that we spent a while on the power conversation tonight, because I think that's also one of the challenging things to get figured out.
Yeah, do you have, you use a AC power supply?
I have a extension cord running from my kitchen window out to my driveway, hooked into a Pyramid DC power supply. Actually, the way I do it now is I have it hooked into a power strip, and I have the DC power supply hooked into that power strip, and then I actually hook all of my PWM stuff straight into the power strip, and everything that's not PWM into the DC power supply.
Yeah.
And having that stuff separated is nice, because then when I go to a dark site, I run one battery goes to an inverter that has like a couple of AC ports and USB ports, and then the other battery goes straight to all my other gear.
How about concerns with the actual regulation of the power? Like with the CCD, you don't want interference. I know astrophysics is specific about the pyramid power supplies, and I don't know if it's 13.7 volts or whatever it is, but is that a legitimate concern?
Experience in astrophotography says no, but experience in robotics and engineering says yes, and it makes and it does make a difference. I don't know specifically about astrophysics, what they require, but I know some cameras will just shut off if you're not getting the right supply. So, you'll know what requires a certain supply if you're using a deep cycle battery, and it starts dissipating because at some point something will turn off at the end of the night. But for example, if you try to plug your Canon into a 12-volt power supply, it usually doesn't like that at all. I don't know how you would get a 12-volt power supply for it, but it wants 7 volts, so you have to make something that converts from the 12 down to the 7 volts. And I know people who have tried their Canons by messing up their power adapter. QSI is pretty specific about what they want coming into their camera as well. I think that the mounts typically can fluctuate. Their supply can fluctuate a little more. Obviously, laptops are pretty specific about what you're giving them. Usually, you need to get a specific. Oh, and that's one power supply we didn't talk about was a DC laptop power supply. If you search Amazon, you can usually find one for yours, but a lot of them use something weird like 19.2 volts or 17.4 volts. But that's why I like the pyramids, is because I can regulate that voltage and I know what I'm getting out of it. I think that somebody mentioned the AGM batteries, which I believe are the gel batteries that are really high quality, if I remember right. I think I looked at them at one point, and I think those are true deep cycle batteries that will maybe go through hundreds and hundreds of cycles instead of, I find that the deep cycle marine batteries maybe start degrading after 100 cycles. Somebody correct me if I'm wrong. I think the AGM are the deep cycle gel batteries. I'm trying to read through the comments here. Tim is talking about using a 105 amp hour battery to run his computer mount, guide camera, and DSLR. So that's about in line with what I had mentioned. You can get DC to DC converters on Amazon. So talking about the 12 volt to 7.5 volts for Canons, that's what I used whenever I was using a Canon. But you want to be careful because there's good brands and then sometimes there's cheap Chinese brands. I guess the thing that I try and usually think about is if I'm spending $500 or $1,000 on a piece of gear, then I would rather spend $50 on an adapter or power adapter to it than $20 on a power adapter and risk a non-certified component ruining my gear. I worry less about it breaking and having to replace it, but I worry more about breaking my gear. So again, it's just kind of a cost-benefit thing that only you know the value of your money, but typically I would recommend getting higher quality electronics adapters because there's nothing more frustrating than something hurting out when you're out in the field, or worse yet, if it does damage to your actual electronics.
Yeah, and David's saying you can use a boost converter to get up to the 20 volts for your laptop, or 18 for a G11, or 40 or 48 for the Mighty, if you need to. So there are a few ways to get there.
Yes, and he's right. They are actually surprisingly efficient. I don't know the good quality ones, and maybe David has a couple in mind, but I do know that I was surprised at reading the specs on how efficient they are. That's another thing you want to think about in the field if you're doing a lot of going from 12 to 120 volts, then or 110 volts, then you're gonna be losing power right off the bat. If you're doing a lot of conversion from 12 down to 7 volts, you're going to be losing some of your efficiency. So if you have to do that too often, you're not actually getting the full capacity of your battery. So just another thing to think about when you're running through all of those conversions. So is there anything that I missed tonight that was important to think about in getting going?
I think you covered a lot of it well. It's very possible there are things you missed because it's very possible that someone's going to have a setup that needs some unique part.
Right.
But and that's always going to be the case. I think you covered it well.
Great, thanks. Yeah, I think the idea is to think of your astrophotography setup as a system and just go through piece by piece of how you're going to attach everything, how you're going to power everything, how you're going to connect all of your data information and all of that. There's just, you know, it's one of the beautiful things about astrophotography. When you get nice pictures, you literally have hundreds and hundreds of things working well together at the same time. So you should go
I'm,
ahead.
I'm sorry, I don't want to interrupt you, but one of the things that actually just popped into my mind was tripods. Some of the premium mounts do not come with tripods. You probably know that if you're buying a premium mount, but another price to anticipate. And they're not
Yeah.
cheap.
No, good tripod. You might spend $600 on a AP portable pier, or you might spend $1,600 on one of their Eagle. I guess those are their portable piers, portable tripod piers. Really nice ones, could go up to $1,600. I think that the mounts that start without tripods start even at the Orion. EQ, I guess it might be the HDX 110. Astrophysics mounts usually don't necessarily come with them. MIT doesn't come with one. But yep, another thing to consider as we talked about the mount being just the foundation. If your mount does not come with a tripod or a pier, then you want to make sure you get something really solid. That's what connects it to the ground, and you don't want it moving even a tiny bit.
All right, any other questions? You guys out on YouTube, you guys are welcome to ask in the Q&A, type them in comments. I'll jump out and check if there's anything in comments right now. Forgot that Mountain Hub Ultimate is on my screen. I'm still infatuated with that product. I was infatuated with the Mountain Hub Pro, and now that they've got this thing, it's crazy.
Me too. Me too. One that I did not mention is Elcron. Elcron does really great power supplies and USB hubs, really high quality. And one thing we didn't talk about was actually spitting that data and power over long distances. If you want to run everything from a laptop in your house and it's not wireless, it's another thing to think about is actually sending data over long distances and sending power over long distances. You wouldn't just want to buy a cheap $20 60-foot USB cable and expect it to send data without having to boost the signal or the power. So just another thing to think about is how far you're actually trying to send data and power. But yes, I am obsessed with that mount, whatever you call it, Mount Hub Pro.
Mount Hub Pro Ultimate.
Yeah.
Not
Although
like,
I thought it was $600 or $700, not $1,400 or $1,500.
yeah, but it's integrated into the dovetail now, which is really cool.
Mm-hmm.
That's just
Yeah.
That's awesome.
I'm curious how well the saddle works. I haven't heard anything about the saddle and whether or not it's as strong as the ADMs or the astrophysics.
That we'll have to see. So anybody else have any questions, whether it be related or unrelated? As Josh mentioned, we're going to have a demonstration of remote imaging next week from Mike Miller, and Mike Miller is using a Paramount as well, so since we didn't have anyone to present on Paramount yet, he might be able to give you some of the basics on it, and we're still working on someone else from Paramount to give us a kind of overview of what it's really capable of. But if there aren't any questions, I'm going to just thank our YouTube viewers for coming. There were a lot of people on tonight. I think I saw as many as 13 in the YouTube side and 10 inside the room, and that's people coming and going. So thanks for coming. We'll be back next week, and you can always check us out on YouTube at any point. But thanks for coming, and I'm going to end the broadcast now.